Hi, everyone. This is Paul Shuren with Impact DataSource, and thank you for joining us today. I appreciate everyone taking the time to join the first of our three-part series on economic development incentives. Today, we're going to start off with a great overview called Incentives 101, and then later webinars will dig a little deeper on some of the topics we'll talk about today. In today's webinar, we have Ellen Harple with Smart Incentives joining us, who will be presenting along with me and my partner, Jerry Walker. In terms of some housekeeping items, we'll post the slides of our on our website and make the video of today's webinar available for viewing as well. We'll put all the details in this on a follow-up email to everyone. And also questions, we're going to take questions at the end, so feel free to type those in as you think of them. But let me just start off with a few words about my company, Impact DataSource, who we are. We're an Austin, Texas-based economic consulting firm that specializes in economic and fiscal impact analysis. We develop tools where you can do your own impact yourself, or we can also consult on projects and we can do the analysis for you. We work almost exclusively with economic developers and public entities. My partner, Jerry Walker, who you'll be hearing from later in the webinar, started Impact DataSource in 1993. So we've been doing this for well over 20 years now. Ellen, let me turn it over to you now to introduce yourself and Smart Incentives, and then we can jump right into the webinar.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Ellen Harple. My company is Smart Incentives. I'm located here in Arlington, Virginia. Smart Incentives works with communities to help them make sound decisions throughout the incentives process. I come from an economic development background. My other business is Business Development Advisors, and we work with state and local economic development groups to increase business investment and job growth in their communities. And I started Smart Incentives just a couple of years ago because we found incentives has become certainly a more prominent part of economic development work lately, and our work here is focused on making the incentives process work better for the economic development community by providing processes and solutions that we hope make this difficult topic easier to manage. So to get right into it, for our Incentives 101 webinar, I'm going to start with a chart or a slide that I use almost every time I talk about incentives, because I think when we're talking about this topic, it's important to go back to basics, and that's why do we use incentives? Well, we use incentives to achieve our community's economic development goals. And I know that sounds obvious, and many of us who are participating here today, I think, know this at heart, but a lot of the others that we interact with, even some businesses or policymakers in our community, and even some of our own board members might not view incentives this way. They might see incentives as, say, a necessary evil, a handout or a giveaway just to entice companies to relocate without an understanding of how good incentive programs can and are intended to help us accomplish our broader economic development objectives. So these objectives may vary by location and even by incentive program, but they tend to include things like promoting more and better jobs in our communities, helping our current businesses grow, seeing increased investment in our communities, revitalizing our downtowns or redeveloping brownfield sites, striving to improve quality of life and quality of place for our residents. I'm increasingly seeing incentives tied to sustainability strategies. And we often want our incentive policies and our economic development programs overall to strengthen the tax base in our communities. So these are all good things that incentives can help us achieve. But the key point that I want to make here is that incentives are not just about winning a deal. Smart incentive use is always connected to a larger economic development strategy. So a second theme that I want to talk about in our webcast today is that in today's environment, we really have to have better analytics. And there are two main reasons for this. One is that as incentive use has increased, there are more programs, we're spending more money, and they're used for more projects than ever before. So naturally, this has led to calls for more information on the projects that are being funded and then the outcomes. There's also now an expectation for data-driven, performance-based activity and for lots of openness and transparency in government. And economic development is no exception, no matter how you're structured, whether you're strictly a government agency or entirely in the private sector. There's a greater expectation now for openness and transparency, and better data and analytics can help us respond to these calls for information. Having a defined process built around good data and analytics is especially important since incentive use is coming under more scrutiny. A good process with strong analytics can help reduce risk by identifying problems early on, can help by quantifying net benefits, putting some numbers around expected benefits before the fact, and then monitoring projects after the fact to see if benefits were in fact achieved. Refining our incentive strategies, because the more you know about a company and a project, the better deal you'll be able to craft for your community and the company. And by better, I mean meeting everyone's needs creatively, not winning or trying to one-up the other, but really working together to mutually satisfactory objectives. Better analytics can help us explain and build support for our decisions because solid data and analysis can show what we're doing and why, which means that we're less likely to get beat up over projects, individual projects, because there won't be a sense that we're just throwing money around, but we're following a rigorous process in our decision making. And then, of course, the higher goal is to achieve better outcomes because better decision making up front leads us to better outcomes, and that's what we're all about in the economic development community. So a good process consistently applied can also help us communicate the rationale behind individual incentive decisions as well as overall program use and put it in the context of our broader economic development work and to communicate all of this to interested elected leaders and community groups. So to summarize and illustrate several of the themes that I talked about, I use what I call our 4x4 framework. So the 4x4 framework is about using data and analysis at all 4 stages of the incentive process to enable a future of greater transparency and accountability. So data, analysis, transparency, and accountability when we're working with the recipient. So that involves obtaining background information and conducting due diligence on the company itself. Looking at the deal, understanding whether the proposed project and the terms are a good deal for your community. And so we're going to spend most of our time today talking about these 2 elements, and we'll go into more detail in just a few minutes. But after the fact, too, after the deal is completed, thinking about compliance, so determining whether the company has lived up to the terms of the incentive agreement and met agreed upon milestones. And then effectiveness or accountability, which is understanding whether your incentive programs are helping your community achieve its economic development objectives. So the main takeaways here are 1, that incentives are part of a process, not just a transaction or a deal, and 2, that we can use data and analysis to be sure that we're using incentives effectively and responsibly. So as I said, we'll be breaking this down into each of the component parts, but our main focus today is really on the upfront analysis for decision making around the recipient and the deal. So to dive right into that, well, this just summarizes that the recipient background research and then the deal, a business case analysis of the project, and then in a few minutes, I'll turn it over to Paul and Jerry to talk about doing the community-based ROI or cost-benefit analysis to understand the benefits for the community. So starting with the recipient and the background research, there are a couple of things that you need to know, and then there's probably a lot more information that, depending on the nature of the company and the nature of the project, that you might wish to know. But let's start with the basics, and I always just consider this some basic business intelligence that you want to have on hand, especially when you're meeting directly with the companies. Key point here is that a quick Google search in the few minutes before you're meeting with the company is not enough. You definitely do want to do the Google search because you want to at least know what, for example, your local media is likely to find out about a company if they choose to look into an incentive deal. But as a potential investor, basically, in this project or in this company, you want to know a little bit more about them. So here are the essentials. Basic size and scope, company facts, how big are they, how long have they been in business, what's their revenue, if you can look at their revenue and growth pattern over time, just to get a sense of size and scope of operations. Second, it's really valuable to spend some time learning about the company's main products and services. And if the company has multiple operations, understanding the function and relationship to the rest of the company of the establishment that's proposed for your community. Location of existing operations, understanding where they are now, or have there been any recent changes elsewhere. Again, getting a sense of how well your community fits with their overall operations. Executive or owner background. This is especially important for privately held or very small or new companies for which there might not be a lot of company information available, but understanding a little bit about the individual in charge of the company can give you some good insight into the level of risk and the opportunity that the project provides. And then recent news, again, you want to at least know what others know. You want to know headlines for better or for worse, just to be aware of the environment in which you're making your decision. Of course, as you go along into the negotiation process, and if it's a big project, you want to delve deeper into a lot of other factors, but these are the essentials. And again, the reason for doing this is the more you know about the company, the better deal you're going to be able to create for both the business and your community, both by knowing what their interests are, but also by identifying risk factors up front. So the second part of due diligence is a business case analysis. And here we're thinking about approaching the project as any other investor would. Just because a project, walked in the door doesn't mean it's going to be a good project. It really requires you as the economic developer to ask hard questions to be able to assess the quality of the project, its risks, and the potential to achieve the hoped for outcomes. And so there are a lot of different ways to think about and organize your business case analysis, but I like this 7 M's way of summarizing it. I find it pretty simple and helpful. So just to click through them real quick, market, getting an assessment of overall market conditions, which means the environment in which the company competes and operates, and its expectations for market share. You're kind of trying to get a sense of, is this a growing market? Is it a shrinking market? Do they have a chance to really make a splash in the market? Are there a lot of risk factors? That sort of thing. Management, the 3 most important components of any company: management. Check references, verify backgrounds, understand the nature of the organization and the role of key managers, understand if there's ownership that's different from management, and maybe for certain types of companies checking into the composition of their board. Magic. Why do they think they'll be successful? What is special about this particular project, and what factors are critical to their success? So it might have to do with the nature of their operations. Maybe they have a technology advantage. Maybe they expect to be a lower cost provider. Maybe they are reliant on talent. These things are important to know to, again, assess the quality of the project and the risk that it provides, but also the fit then with your community. How well is your community able to support the things that they need to be successful? The business model, understanding how they intend to make money and be successful, and the schedule and timing of their expectations. Is it a long-term kind of investment, or are they expecting to be successful in the near term, and what does this mean for the expected benefits, again, for your community? Money, sources and uses of funds, getting as specific as you can on their revenue model and other commitments that they have to financing. Hopefully you're not their main financier, you're the last money in, not the first money in. And just making sure that they've got financing in place that doesn't leave you at tremendous risk. Momentum, thinking about the risks to the project's execution, understanding built-in assumptions and potential problems, maybe thinking about a sensitivity analysis to understand if something goes wrong in one part of the project, is the whole project at risk, and what does that mean for you? And then match, so tying it back to the beginning, how is this a good deal for your community? What benefits will this project create? And I think that this seems like a lot of information and a lot of questions to ask, but it's really an appropriate set of questions to ask and doesn't have to require, weeks and weeks of work to get a sense of where a particular project fits in these different categories. So whether you're talking about Tesla coming into your community or a brew pub operation that wants to locate in your community, if they're asking for discretionary incentives, these are all reasonable questions to ask because incentives are a form of investment and they should be treated with the same care as any other investment that you would make. Businesses don't mind being asked business-like questions. They're happy to work with a partner who is responsible and reasonable with their use of funds. And so these kinds of things aren't going to scare away a prospect. I think they prefer to work with somebody that also takes a business-like approach to effective use of money. So the second part of deal analysis is often referred to as ROI, or analysis of community benefits, or a cost-benefit analysis. And so the key point here is, now that you have a sense of the risk of the recipient and the quality of the project just of itself, now is the time to start to try to understand, can this opportunity generate net benefits for our community? Not will they generate net benefits, but do they have the possibility, the potential to generate these net benefits? So I'm going to turn it over to Paul and Jerry, who are going to talk about a couple of different analyses that can help you understand and quantify these potential benefits.
Let me first start by saying about, or answering actually, what is an economic impact analysis? And they're referred to by various names: economic impact analysis, fiscal impact analysis, economic and fiscal impact analysis, cost-benefit analysis, and rate of return on investment analysis. But whatever they're called, the analysis is a calculation of the worth of a project, firm, or activity to a state or community. It should be used to determine appropriate levels of incentives. And our reports that we do are typically 40-page reports. And the ways to evaluate incentives there are various ways. There's common ways, and a lot of them are some of them are old school, such as give the firm what they ask for, guess, use the back of the napkin to make some calculations, go with a large round number to impress a prospect, such as $2 million, and offer $4,000 per job. But the best way, we believe, to determine the appropriate levels of incentives is by using an objective, consistent, analytical approach with an impact analysis. And an impact analysis can be used we suggested use an economic and fiscal impact analysis to determine the net fiscal impact to affected taxing entities. And the impact analysis can compare the investment, the incentives amount, and the returns on investment, the net fiscal benefit, to determine rate of return on investment and payback period. And this is how businesses, as well as most individuals, make investment decisions. And some rules of thumb on incentives that we've seen: overall, incentives should be provided to projects where the additional public revenues generated by the project exceed additional public cost. And the larger the rate of return on investment, the better the deal is for the community. And the shorter the payback period, again, the better the deal is for the community. And a general guideline is that communities only consider investments that result in a rate of return greater than 10% and a payback period of less than 10 years. But each community should establish its own minimum investment objectives. Some other rules of thumb that we encourage, or we'd like to point out, is if a firm is leasing a building, consider the lease term as the maximum payback period. The city should get its money back before the lease expires. And go outside the box on community changing deals, such as if an Apple wanted to come to your community, for example. And also, incentives should be provided to projects that improve the quality of life of residents. And also, incentives should be concentrated on target industries and give incentives to basic industries, those that export products and bring in new dollars and create more spin-off economic impacts in the community. And don't offer incentives to firms that will be harmful or destroy existing businesses. So with that in mind, should incentives be given to Walmart, especially if you're a small town and your downtown has a very vibrant business environment and such as plumbing supplies, boutiques, and other things. Businesses would basically be destroyed if Walmart is built on the outskirts of town. Another rule of thumb is to make incentives available equally to existing local businesses and to businesses recruited from outside the community. It's much more efficient and less costly to retain existing local businesses and assist local businesses to expand than to recruit a business from outside the community. And now my partner, Paul Shuren.
We want to connect up everything that Ellen was talking about with what Jerry was discussing, and what was baked into that was a point of view about how economic impacts will interact with the fiscal impacts. And so if we can go to the next slide here, we can take a look at kind of our point of view on economic impacts and how this all plays out. Certainly this isn't set in stone, but I think this is a way that might help you think about things. And so here, you can think of this as initially something happening that we can quantify as an economic impact. So the business locates or expands in the community, and that generates some direct as well as those spin-off spending, and they'll generate this new economic activity. And that economic activity is going to drive some fiscal impact. So as we move along, we can see that new business and the spin-off businesses and the households will generate some additional tax revenues for the local taxing entities, as well as they may impose some costs, and so they may be demanding some additional local government services, so police, fire, EMS, schools, so on like that. But then as we look at all of this together, we can calculate or take a look at what we think of as social welfare. And so is there a change in social welfare, and how, and is it positive? So if the social welfare of a community's residents increases when the revenues from this chain of events exceeds the cost of those additional services. And so this enables local governments to provide more or improve services or lower tax rates. So I want to go now to look at an example of basically some results. So I'm kind of jumping to the end. We're going to go into a good bit of detail on the impact analysis part of this modeling and of this process in Thursday's webinar, but we can get a taste of it now. And so here, for a given project, we just kind of made up a project, and we estimated some impacts. And so this is for a city here in Texas, and the project is going to be generating, and it's associated with a certain number of jobs, and they're getting paid salaries, and it's in a particular industry. All that is kind of already taken into the analysis. We've done a lot of the work that Ellen has already described about making sure that this seems like a good idea. Now we're trying to identify that if this project can produce net benefits. And so in this case, what we're looking at, we've calculated some local revenues for this city in terms of sales taxes, property taxes that might be supported by the project, some property taxes that could be supported by new residential property, again from maybe the population change, some city-owned utility revenues. The city's getting some revenues from franchise fees on utilities, potentially building permits and fees, hotel occupancy taxes, and then some miscellaneous taxes and user fees. So in total, this project is generating benefits of about $940,000. If we balance that with some costs to provide municipal services and also the cost to provide those city-owned utility services, we see that the net benefits there, the bottom line, or roughly bottom line, on the net basis is about $593,000. And so this is where we're able to do that comparison of the expected additional benefits in terms of the fiscal impact and balancing it with the costs. And so we have a net benefit of about $593,000. So if we move on and we were to think about if we were to provide, we can just as a reminder, we want to do this for not just the city, but you might want to look at how the county, the school district, possibly even including the state in this analysis might be of interest. But generally speaking, if you're a local economic developer, so you're working either on behalf of the city or you're working for the city, you would be most interested probably in that line item there for the city, the $593,000 that we talked about. So if the city, and we can move to the next slide, we're going to provide an incentive. Maybe the project has indicated that there's a gap in the funding, and that this new building, they weren't planning on running the water line out to the new building. That really wasn't baked into their numbers, and so now they're seeking an investment from the Economic Development Corporation, asking for this infrastructure grant of, say, $250,000. And what we're looking at here is a kind of a representation of that. And so if we think about the incentive, the infrastructure grant, as an investment in the project, we see that being paid out there, the $250,000 in year one. And we compare that to the return on the investment, which we view as that those net benefits to the city, about $600,000 over the 10-year period. And so we can calculate that rate of return that we see there, the 24%, and the payback period of about 4.1 years. And so you can see we have a reference line in there on the total incentive. That orange dashed line intersects the net benefits going across, and we can see that the payback period is just about 4 years. And so you can see in this case an investment of $250,000. You could, with this analysis, we can calculate a rate of return and a payback period. Again, we could look at this a couple of different ways and think about a different amount. Let's say that it was going to cost $500,000. Would that be as good of a deal? Well, certainly not, but we might be able to then calculate a payback period and a rate of return in that scenario. This is an example of an investment where there's really kind of a grant, kind of cash out of pocket. If we go to the next slide, we can take a look at looking at a property tax abatement. And so in this case, based on the property or the company's new investments, the city may be thinking about some tax abatements. And if you get real close to your computer screen, you can kind of see this, but we're assuming that in this case anyway, we're modeling that the city might abate the building property taxes at 50% for the first 5 years. And then the furniture, fixtures, and equipment kind of have this declining abatement schedule. And then inventories, we're saying, would be abated at 100% for the full 10-year term. And so if all of that were considered in the analysis, then we could see that the property tax liability with respect to the city at a full amount was about $236,000, would be reduced by $131,000. So the net collected might be only about $105,000. And so in this way, we're calculating this value of the abatement, and that's reducing the revenue to the city from the property tax revenues. And then this helps visualize things a little bit, and you can see over time that most of this is kind of stacked to be upfront, kind of, or not upfront, but just kind of in the earlier years, and then declines over time. And then I think we can skip forward to the next slide. This is just another representation of showing kind of our impact dashboard model, which summarizes a lot of these impacts all in one place, and we can see some of the economic impacts listed there off to the left-hand side. That show the number of jobs, both the direct and the total jobs, the average salaries, some of that capital investment summary, and possible residential development. Again, we're going to get into more of this kind of detail in the session on Thursday, and so I won't really take up any more time on this, but if we just click forward, I can summarize what we're talking about here with the impact analysis. It's our recommendation or our suggestion that you conduct an economic and fiscal impact analysis for your economic development projects to validate their economic value to the community and help determine appropriate incentives. And using a rate of return and a payback period framework or analysis should be the primary factors in awarding those incentives. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ellen to kind of jump back in and discuss some of the things on the other side of the deal.
I'll just repeat all of those wonderful words I was just saying. So apologies. So I did start by thanking Paul and Jerry for that, and to say, as Paul said, we're going to go back now. If we think about the 4x4 framework and the 4 elements, and so we talked about the recipient and the deal, and now we want to think about the other side, which is compliance and evaluation. And so in terms of compliance, we want to look at project performance, and then in terms of evaluation, we want to understand how well did our programs perform in terms of achieving our economic development goals, because we want to answer that question: did this deal generate all of those expected net benefits for our community, all the ones that we calculated up front, all the ones that we expected? We want to use these two elements, compliance and evaluation, to figure out if in fact they did accomplish what we hoped for. So here I'm just really going to present a couple of concepts for you all to think about. So in terms of compliance monitoring, what is required, and was there in fact a performance agreement? There should always be a performance agreement, but an ICMA survey last year found that only 56% of local governments require a performance agreement when providing incentives. I hope and I believe that the actual number using performance agreements is much higher, but there absolutely should be one. It's basically a gift to the company, and that's not what any of us intend. We definitely hope to see some outcomes and some benefits for our communities. So it's really important to define those expected outcomes and the performance requirements for the company up front. These can include things like Paul was just mentioning, like the timing of it and tying the project time frame to the fiscal break-even point, and requiring progress reports on the measures of merit that you care about, whether it is jobs or investment or revitalizing a particular site or creating investment in a specific site or neighborhood in your community. Whatever it is, everyone needs to agree to what they are, have them laid out in the performance agreement, and then hopefully reported upon in a way that helps you track it so that you can report on and evaluate how well the project has proceeded. So within that, you want to think about how are you going to obtain the data and track it. Company reports are pretty typical for incentive agreements, but you can also access other state and local administrative records to verify or check on some of the key variables. Sometimes you have access to different types of tax records, again at the state or local level, just to verify, and some of them are publicly available in any case, like property records or labor records that you can sometimes access to verify jobs and wages. But you might also look at the local level, certificates of occupancy or building permits or other types of property records, just to see if the activity proceeded in the way and the shape and form that you expected. Something else though to think about is exactly whose job is it? The economic development organization will often be asked to provide this information and to report on it. So it's helpful to make sure that that's somebody's job and that they've got the resources and the training to be able to do that over time. Thinking about whether information provided by the company can be verified, which we just talked about. Thinking about what you do with the information, so tracking it and having companies report it is a good first step, but then thinking about how you bring all of that information together for all the different projects that you're engaged in to figure out if there's a need for to intervene maybe, or to get more information from the company, or maybe there's a problem that needs to be solved, just to kind of get the individual projects on track. But there's also a wider reporting function that you can do once you have really good information to explain to others what the incentive program and policies are accomplishing for your community. And then thinking about whether there's a closeout process for individual projects, so that you can say after a certain point of time you're not going to collect more information, the incentive, the terms of the agreement have been met on both party sides, and that there's a way to close out that project. Key point here, though, is however you decide to pursue these different elements of the process, it's important at some level just to simply collect the data so that you can see what's working and what's not in your community. So compliance is about whether projects met the benchmarks and companies did what they said that they would do. Program evaluation is different. This is how well do our programs work, and are they helping us achieve our economic development goals? Program evaluation is not easy, but some steps again here to think about are defining your program goals clearly up front. It's pretty surprising how vague a lot of economic development incentive programs are in terms of what they say they're trying to accomplish. The more specific that you can be, maybe not in terms of like meeting, really specific benchmarks, but that it's clear what the intent of the program is, that it's meant to, create new jobs or attract new jobs, or it's meant to have more jobs of a certain quality. Whatever it is, something that is clearly communicated and measurable is important up front. And then identifying metrics that are aligned with those program goals, so not just what you're hoping to achieve, but then thinking about what are the specific measures of merit that you're going to look at over time to figure out if you were able to meet those goals. Consider data sources when choosing metrics. This is an area where, again, there's kind of surprising gaps. You might know what you're hoping to accomplish, and you might know what metrics that you would like to use, but it turns out there's not a reliable or affordable or accessible data source for those metrics. So you really do need to think about how you're going to get the data and how costly it is when you're choosing those metrics. Something that we hear more and more often is that we really need to go beyond job counts when we're evaluating our incentive programs and our economic development activities overall. I think there's a real hunger for better metrics besides just, kind of crude job counts. So this might include some ways to get at the quality of the job, maybe the skill level involved or the wages involved, or I know a lot of communities try to only incentivize companies that offer jobs with certain types of benefits. But there are other things that you can think of too for maybe your workforce development or your community development programs. So again, you might connect it back to maybe some sustainability metrics that your community has, or quality of life and quality of place metrics. I think there's a real interest in finding different ways to define a set of metrics that help explain how you're moving your community towards these higher order goals, as well as just more or different types of jobs. Using consistent definitions and reporting mechanisms so that you can compare and contrast your program accomplishments. And then super important is using all of this to communicate findings, not just, internally to support and enable better decision making within the economic development group, but to talk to your stakeholders who aren't spending a lot of time thinking about these programs otherwise. Program evaluation can be very complicated, and incentive programs and the financing behind them can be very complicated. It's not super easy to report on all of these things, and so using your program evaluation as a way to tell your story, but backed up by really robust data and analysis is something really valuable that this step can do. And this is a good time to mention a project that I've been working on called the Business Incentives Initiative. This is a joint effort between the Pew Charitable Trusts and the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness. And the purpose of this initiative has been to identify effective ways to manage and assess incentive policies and practices, to improve data collection and analysis, because there are many difficult methodological and technical data gathering challenges that need to be solved in order to effectively evaluate incentive programs. And the initiative has made a lot of progress towards solving several of those problems. And then to share information on good practices and that states and communities can use to report on their economic development incentives. So this project has been going on for almost 2 years now. We've just completed a series of workshops for state economic development groups and state evaluation organizations and other state agencies that need to be engaged in the process. And so we're hoping that there will be a guide or a publication that comes out at before the end of the year that brings a lot of these ideas together so that we can continue to share information with each other and build on best practices. So just to share a couple of thoughts on what we've learned. I think, and I mentioned this at the beginning of this slide, one of the biggest challenges is the lack of clearly defined program goals, that they're often vague and not measurable, and that as we write new incentive, whether it's legislation or administrative rules, trying to make these program goals more clear and measurable will help all of us down the road. We are making progress on data management challenges, including collecting, validating, sharing, and reporting on what's been accomplished, but this remains a work in progress. But again, there's a lot to share, so if folks are struggling with different elements of the data gathering and reporting process, I think that there's, we have better ways to address some of the common challenges now. There is a desire to look beyond job and investment tallies for many of our programs. And evaluations and transparency initiatives should be part of a dialogue with policymakers and other stakeholders that focuses on program improvement and achieving shared economic development goals, really taking a teamwork approach. Everyone's on the same side in terms of community economic development. We're trying to make our places better, make our communities better places to live and work. And so everyone should be on the same team to defining programs that will help us do that. So that's a good lead into this topic of reporting and communication. So evaluations are only one way that we can communicate with wider audiences, but all throughout the process, elected officials and community groups are demanding better data from economic development groups on incentive use. For many of us, reporting has traditionally just meant our annual report, which we put up on our website in a PDF form, or maybe a summit of some sort where a small segment of the community comes and maybe there's one article that's written about it, and that's pretty much the end of our communication on what we've done as economic developers, and that's not going to cut it anymore. We really need to provide more information kind of more consistently and in better context to our audiences who want the economic development efforts in their community, I think, to succeed, but they also need them to be, because especially on the incentive side, we know that they're controversial. And so sharing as much information as we're able to for greater transparency in what's been done, and then greater understanding of what it's helped accomplish is where we're trying to go with this. Now, this is not easy to do. Reporting on this kind of information is challenging. So what we're thinking, and this is pretty much a rough framework, it's not really prescriptive, but we think that there should be a lot of kind of ongoing reporting, and reporting should reflect different types of information and recognize the needs of different audiences at different points in the process. So a way that we've been thinking about it, instead of just kind of this one-off annual report, is you can think of it as some sort of ongoing, or maybe a quarterly, or some sort of regular release of basic deal details. Not every element of every deal, but basically, who are you working with, and what are the parameters of the deal, and what are the basic expectations, kind of just in a tabular format. Answers most of the questions of most of the people who are interested in this, just basic transparency stuff. In terms of the annual report, this is a chance to provide a little bit more color to the basic transactional information, explaining what you did, why you did it, and what's been achieved over the last year, but also the direction that the overall program is going in. So because a lot of these, especially incentivized projects, are multi-year, so you can't report on everything that happened and all the outcomes in a single year. So being able to tell that story and laying it out over time is valuable information to a lot of people. And then thinking about conducting a formal program evaluation, maybe not every year for every program, but it looks like every 3 to 5 years for most types of incentive programs is sufficient. And then providing a feedback loops, both to improve internal decision making, but also to improve policy making, so that the folks that are writing the statutes in your community have a sense of what works and what doesn't work. And so again, the whole idea is to advance the field in such a way that everyone you have better policies and better ability to make good decisions for your community. And then we really need to do a lot more work, I think, in our field about helping present this information in more creative ways, because it is complicated. But I think that there are different graphical and online and different tools that aren't just PowerPoint or Excel or Word documents or PDFs to help present this information in more creative ways that help us absorb it and understand it. So just to, some summary thoughts on data collection and management. It's important to spend some time doing this because it can show what we're accomplishing through incentives. We're making progress by using incentives toward agreed upon economic development goals, and we can show that we're meeting program objectives. So we're using the funds that have been provided both effectively and responsibly. It can help us improve decision making, as we talked about for the first 2/3 of our webcast, and then it can also help us communicate our work on behalf of our communities. So some concluding thoughts before we turn it over to some Q&A are that, bottom line, incentives should be used to accomplish community goals, not just win a deal. We as economic developers need better data and analytics so that we can identify what works and enable sound decisions when awarding incentives. But these tools can also help us communicate our work to external stakeholders in a more effective way. So those are that's the end of our formal presentation, and I'm going to turn it back over to Paul to manage the Q&A and talk about what's coming next.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Yeah, just a reminder to everyone, this is the first of a three-part series, so we're going to be talking about impact analysis on Thursday this week, and then next Tuesday we'll be talking more about tracking and reporting ED effectiveness. And going into a lot of these topics that we touched on today, we'll go into a little bit more detail. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the question box and send them to us. We had a few questions from kind of early on, so we'll take one of the things that we wanted to touch on. The question was just really just generally, how can I communicate or educate my board on the process, city council or board, on the process of incentives. And I guess that's something that in our, speaking for Impact DataSource here and for our role, as we're pulled in to do an analysis, we will be available for conversations with stakeholders, whether the city council or the ED board, and be able to answer questions specifically about the impact analysis that was being run, and giving them some of that overview of how things that I touched on earlier about how the economic impacts drive fiscal impacts and how that can ultimately be a good measure. Looking at the net fiscal impact is trying to measure whether or not this is a good deal or not, or a good project or not, and then using that process to look at incentives. Ellen, I don't know if you want to take and talk about from your perspective and kind of thinking about an economic developer and communicating with their city council or board on the whole process of incentives.
Right. I think this is so interesting to think about because I mostly spend most of my time talking to economic developers, so we can get down in the weeds pretty quickly, and we use words in the same way, and we know where we're going with the process. But people that don't spend their time doing this, it really is a black box to them. So, very often they're, especially elected officials or board members, they're spending their time dealing with many different issues that they're asked to evaluate. So they're never going to have the time to become experts on the topic. So a couple of guidelines that I find work is just really going back to basics, kind of grounding it in what we're doing and why, and answering questions, of course, and providing information as requested on the details of programs and projects, but really grounding it in the overall strategy and the big picture of why we're doing this in the first place, because that really does get lost almost as soon as you start talking about an individual deal. So connecting that deal to the bigger picture is really important. I think having conversations on an ongoing basis, not just every once in a while or just when a high-profile and maybe controversial project comes up, but so everyone has some sort of common foundation for making decisions instead of just again having something all of a sudden that's difficult to evaluate and understand, and it might be causing them some political pain. You don't want that to be the only time that you're interacting with them. Another thing is to, I think, not be completely dismissive of the political side of things and the way that they are hearing about incentives maybe from their constituents, which we might tend to say, oh well, that's a silly argument, or why are they focused on that? But people are asking that question. So whether it's but for, or subsidy versus incentive, or however it's being framed in your community, being prepared to talk about that and say, well, and not just to be dismissive of it. It's something else I would suggest. And then you can't, I think you can't have too many good examples to say, well, I understand your concerns, but here's how this plays out in practice, and here's a picture of it, and here's how it was, here's how it was before, and here's how it's better now, and having something really tangible for them to hold on to. It's like, oh yeah, okay, I see now where we're going with this. This is why it's worthwhile. So those are just a few lessons learned, that I'd be interested in the group's thoughts too about how to handle that part of the process.
And it looks like we have time for a few more questions. We want to try and keep it right to 1 hour here. But Ellen, there's a question here about what tools are recommended for the due diligence of a company that you're negotiating with. So this was something that you talked about, of kind of doing that background and going beyond, like you said, just a Google search. I think that's something that you offer, right, as a service, but then also maybe if you can just kind of give some tips on some of the sources that you might that economic developers might find useful in trying to do some of that research.
Right. So there are some of the standard kind of business reference databases, and I think that those are useful. So maybe Dun & Bradstreet or Hoover's, LexisNexis. Sometimes if you have access to those either directly or maybe through a library or through a university research agreement, these are helpful just go-tos for some basic information about size and scope of company, maybe where other operations are, some sense of the management, a little bit about the financial history of the company or financial records. State corporation commissions can be very helpful for the ownership and background ownership information, so you can see who's behind companies and how long they've been in business. A good news search, I tend to use Factiva, but there's Avention. There are a lot of different other news sources where you can go back several years for news stories on different companies. There are a couple of federal databases that let you look at if you have international prospects. I always find they're the most difficult, but just kind of real rough order of magnitude checks to make sure they're not on any, kind of bad actor lists. I'm trying to think of other financial sources of information. I know I'm missing one. Maybe you can send me an email directly and I can send you a more thorough answer to that. But those are a couple of the essential sources of information.
Great. Thanks, Alan. There was a question, I'll just take a couple more here. And there's one question about one of the slides we had touched on about an incentive rule of thumb relating back to the lease period of a building. And I think in general, the concept is if the firm is leasing a building, you might want to set your payback period to be before the end of that lease term. It's always a little tricky, just depending, seeing what type of commitment the company is making in your community. If they're leasing a building, that might be a little suspect. So if you are normally we might do a 10-year analysis, but if it's a 5-year lease, you probably don't want to look at an incentive where you have a 7-year payback period because while you'd like to keep them around forever and ever, so well beyond 7 years, well beyond 10 years maybe, if you've got a 5-year lease sitting there, maybe it's in the best interest for the community to kind of look at an incentive that hits a payback period before the end of that lease term. Then there was one other question that I wanted to get to, and maybe Ellen can jump in on this one as well. I'll take a little bit of a stab at it first, but having to do with the best practices for a local economic development report card. And I think in general, just like everything with economic development, it's very specific to your community, and so you may have your area may be a particular city, or you could be talking about a bigger region, so that would drive some of the differences in how you would put together some sort of economic development report card. As Ellen mentioned, kind of going beyond just the job count number is probably good. Looking at job creation, or kind of maybe the jobs that were created in the area, or kind of the differences at points in time, and showing which industries kind of compose or where the jobs are located kind of by industry. That's probably going to be useful and kind of interesting to look at, but also having a clear understanding of what what the new businesses will be doing in the community. And so one of the things that we provide would be in looking at an impact analysis of an economic development organization over a period of time. And so that might be over a 1-year period or a 5-year period, looking at the projects that they supported or that they worked with in some way, and evaluating those, in terms of all of those attributes of, the direct and the spin-off jobs, the salaries that are being paid to direct and spin-off workers, and getting into and boiling it down to the net fiscal impacts kind of on whole, kind of looking at, and in that way, we're able to look at, for this group of, say, 10 projects, the city will receive X amount in net benefits over the next 10 years from these projects that were supported in fiscal year 2015, let's say. And that can be a good way to kind of show your, if the city or some sort of funding agency is giving you support, and that, so for every dollar that gets put into economic development, you can show the return on that in terms of these net benefits. Now, just talking about hardcore, which statistics should we gather for an economic development report card if you're just trying to give a scope? I think there's kind of a range of those things, and a lot of times it's difficult to get down to a very local level if we're talking about a city. A lot of the data is only available at the county level as you look at sources from the BLS or the BEA or the census. So getting some of that information can be difficult. Ellen, I don't know if you want to jump in and have any suggestions on best practices for this idea of an economic development report card.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said, Paul, and I think that a key to success is having consistent data that you report consistently, or building on these consistent processes that we've been talking about, so that people can follow it over time, and it's not just this one-off, document, but people can see that there is progress being made over time towards these higher goals, and having ways for whatever you're reporting on to be connected to your economic development strategy or some higher order goals is also useful. And the only other thing that I'd mention is that I like report cards that have some economic context in it, so maybe like the BLS data that give you the economic setting for the community that you're in, but then also separately from that, so it doesn't look like you're taking credit for everything that happens in the entire economy, having reports on what you do and having kind of a rigorous way to track and report on that. But I like report cards that have both, because if you do economic development without the broader economic context, I think something gets lost there, and people may have maybe unrealistic expectations about what the economic development organization can accomplish and what it means.
Okay, well, that sounds great, and I think that kind of brings us to the end of the hour, and we appreciate everybody joining us today. Again, we've got 2 more webinars in this series, and we're going to get these slides out to everyone and hopefully get this video posted shortly. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. Thanks to Ellen, and thanks to Jerry for presenting today, and we'll catch you all Thursday. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you all.